Hello everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this is the Dominaria United State of the Format Address episode. This is the episode that we do about a week or so after the new set comes out, where I try to deliver to you as much info I know about my experiences in the format, help you get a better understanding of the format, which of course leads to, hopefully you winning a bit more, you enjoying the format a bit more. If you're watching this episode live on Twitch or on YouTube afterwards, you might have noticed wearing a sweet pair of shades here. And this is not a fashion statement. I had a little medical emergency yesterday, which is why this episode was delayed. Got something stuck in my eye. I'm okay now. They gave me eye drops, but side effect of those eye drops is my eyes are a bit sensitive, hence the shade. So we're all good. Just figured I would address this now before we got into the episode, and I got a bunch of comments. Anyways, let's jump in. Right before we do that, of course, gotta shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Big shout out to everybody who supports each week, and especially this week. There's a lot of new patrons, so really appreciate that. If you want to support the show, if you like what's going on here, and if you want to get better at Limited Magic, that's a big thing that I want to highlight. This is one of the best places you can go. We help you a lot over there, whether it's through the Discord, where there's a bunch of private channels over there with a lot of people that'll help you, including myself. You get direct access. There's coaching tiers. There's draft log deck review tiers. There's video draft log review tiers. You can send me a video or send me your draft log. I'll send you a video. You get some feedback. All that kind of good stuff all over there. Check it out. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the place you can go if you want the show to keep on keeping on, basically. So without further ado, let's get into our State of the Format address. Okay, so where I want to start today is acknowledging the fact that Dominaria United is a very hard format to draft. I spent a lot of time prepping for this podcast, or for every episode of this podcast, by reading Discord and Twitter and hanging out in various Twitch chats and even venturing into the depths of Reddit to kind of just better understand what the drafting population's experiences have been with the set. And maybe where they're having trouble, where they're not quite clicking with the format, having trouble understanding. I think it's important as a content creator to do that, because it can be very easy to, get trapped inside of, just kind of your own little world, basically, especially if you are talking to people that are winning a lot. You're like, oh yeah, this is good. Obviously, people, I get this format. Why doesn't everybody else get this format, right? I very much try not to get into that echo chamber. And a prevailing sentiment that I've seen across multiple platforms has been, this format is the most difficult format that I have drafted, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong, basically. Which I think is pretty frustrating. When so many content creators, including myself, are like, yeah, this format is great, so much fun, I've been there myself, where the community perception of a format doesn't quite line up with your own, and you can kind of feel like you're missing out on something, right? And so if there is a format like Dominaria that's really tricky, that people are having trouble with, I try to put a lot of time into thinking about how to package ideas so they're very clear and concise, and the average drafter can take them into their next draft and start winning more, right? That's the whole purpose of what I do here. And usually, I would say in the last few years, most sets in the last few years, it's been pretty easy to tell somebody the story of the format, like the rules of engagement, what's good in the format, right? Often, there's a dominant deck, or a group of dominant decks, or a color that's really good, or a certain mechanic that I can point to and give you a level 1 analysis of like, yeah, this archetype mechanic, pretty good. I think you should be biasing towards this if you can. If you're having trouble, maybe bias towards this a little bit more. But I don't think it's going to work that well for teaching you how to draft this format. I really like how Ben on Loaders Limited put it this week. He said that as content creators, we often try to give the audience fishes, right? Teach them how to fish versus giving them fish. And it's a quick hit of how to do well in the format. We're just like, here's the fish, go draft. And I think that there are relatively few fish to give the audience in this format. And so this being limited level ups, where I do try to focus on making you a better Magic player and not just give you, not just better at a given format. I tried to do that too, but I want this to be a holistic thing. I want to try to lean into that today and really make this State of the Format episode more about how to fish than giving fish. It's going to be a little bit more about broad topics rather than specifics. I'm going to get into some specifics, and I'm going to get into the chat Q&A. Of course, we're going to get into specifics there, so I am relying on chat to, kind of be able to be like, hey, like, what do you think about this card or whatever. I think given this episode and future episodes too in this format are going to be really, really good for teaching you how to fish. And that's what I'm going to try to do. Give you some big picture concepts that apply to this format. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that's 100% doable in this hour and a bit long podcast. So I really want to use this format kind of just as a jumping off point of sorts, right? For level ups pertaining to the ideas and the themes of this format. Anyways, that's my kind of foreword. Let's get into why this is a difficult format and how to approach it. So I think the reason that there aren't many of these fish, quote unquote, to give in this format is there's a lot going on thematically with a bunch of different synergy overlaps between the colors, and there are relatively few handholds, right? And the archetypes are pretty loosely defined. There's not, it's very much not a draft set where you take a card, pick one, pack one, and then there's specific cards that go with it, right? The cards are very broad. They can lead you in very different directions in different drafts. And, the other thing too is that I think that the format is pretty balanced too. Which sounds weird as, if I'm talking about why this format is difficult, it's weird to say, oh, the format's balanced, why would that be difficult? Well, one, like I said, I can't just tell you to draft a certain color pair and win, right? Because there's not anything that's like so much better than anything else. But more specifically, there's a ton of reasonable paths to take in each draft, and thus more opportunities than usual to make an incorrect decision, right? So if you have a pack that's just like full of good cards, you could easily take the one that I think is not the best card for you to take in a specific situation. In most sets, you can narrow down picks to like one or two cards, and you can be like, okay, well, this set's not that deep in playables, so I know I can identify card A, card B, I make a decision. This set is really deep on playables, and there's a good amount of modularity in how you might value different cards, and that just adds another layer of difficulty, because, I can't just say here, these are the best cards, these are the best archetypes. There's a lot of complexities. Other complexities that are balancing when to take lands over spells, when to take a worse card over a better card for synergy purposes, and, just a bunch more things that I probably don't have to tell you if you're finding this format difficult. And so, how do we remedy this issue? Well, again, I want to start broad here and talk about things that this format rewards. You might not be an expert at all these things yet, but I think these are just framing tools for the format. These are things that I've noticed, I've been leaning into myself when drafting, but also when I've been coaching or, again, looking through social media, things that I've noticed players aren't finding, the things that players are doing that aren't finding success in the format. And I'm calling these habits of highly effective DMU drafters. So the first habit, it's the biggest one, I think, is stay open, stay flexible in the draft. This is advice that you hear all the time with draft, right? Stay open, don't get locked in. But I think it's so important in this format to really keep an open mind. So often I'll go through a draft log where somebody will take, easily the best card, pick one, pack one. And I think that's where it's pretty easy at that point. I said there's a lot of cards you can pick from, but usually there's a standout pick one, pack one. And then as soon as you get to pick two, pick three, pick four, it does get pretty difficult. And what I've noticed is a lot of the time, people just lock in on pick three, pick four. They pick a blue, red, gold card, maybe a Balmor, which is the 1/3 flyer that pumps your team when you cast spells. And then they go lightning strike, and they're like, okay, I'm blue, red. And instead, I think it's just so much better to kind of just like take a bunch of good cards early. They could even be in, if there's overlapping cards, you take, blue card first pick, blue card second pick, great. Or you take a gold, blue, red card first pick, take a monocolored blue card second pick, that's great. But I'm really not afraid to take a blue, red, gold card, pick one, pack one, and then take a black, green, gold card, let's say, in pick two, right? Because there are so many playables, and it's very, I'm not going to say it's very difficult to miss on playables, but you're just less likely to miss on playables in this format. And I think so much of the time when I look at a deck that somebody goes, oh, hey, why didn't this deck do well? It's because their cards like 15 to 23 aren't very good. And that happens when you lock in too early, because it's like, okay, I'm this deck, you decided that in pack one, and then it's just not open, right? And it's just like, well, why did you go down this path? It's like, well, I started with these cards, but then you just locked in too early. So really my advice is just cherry pick the best cards. Almost all of pack one, right? I would say up until the wheel. My strategy has been take the best cards within reason. Sometimes you do take a card that is close in power, right? You don't want to take the best card regardless of what you have previously. You're taking that into account too. But you've kind of just got this array of good cards, good payoff cards, right? And I want to specify too, I'm often taking maybe gold cards as payoffs, maybe stuff like Tolarian Terror, maybe it's rares, cards that I can build towards, right? And then once I get to pick 6, pick 7, pick 8, and then the wheel, then I'm really kind of can figure out, okay, what's open at this table? What has come back? What am I getting late in the pack? And then you can start to, dial in a bit more. But I do think one of the most common mistakes in this format is just, pick 4, you already decided your deck, and you're taking bad cards pick 5. And that's just such a trap, I think. Okay, so another habit of highly effective drafters in Dominaria is they are Gardener drafters and not Architect drafters. So this is a concept that you might hear this apply to a bunch of different fields. In writing, there's this concept of the Gardener writer and the Architect writer. And the Architect writer is somebody who knows exactly what their story is going to be before they put the pen to the paper. They've planned it all out, and they're just filling in the boxes as they go. Maybe, they changed a few things here and there, but they've got this blueprint, and they're just filling it out. And the Gardener is going, well, let's see where my story takes me. Let's see how it evolves. Let's see, a little bit of this. Oh, I didn't realize this would happen. Let's take that. And you can really apply this to drafting. There's a really old episode of Limited Resources where BDM, Brian David Marshall, talks about this. And this format really reminds me of that, where I think it's a really poor approach, or it won't help you if you're going into each draft thinking, here's how you draft blue-red. Here's how you draft blue-white. I mean, it's good to have those baselines, and it's good to, have a general understanding of, what the decks are trying to do. But the decks in this format are really about, evolving and morphing as the draft goes on. I'm rarely doing a full pivot in my drafts because it's not really about, I'm blue-white, now I'm shifting to blue-red. I'm rarely doing a pivot. I'm doing a kind of a morph, right? Where it's like, okay, well, I picked up a red card here. Maybe I splash it. Maybe I don't. Maybe I do transition to blue-red when I was white-red or something like that, It's that same mindset I was just talking about a second ago of not locking in early, but you're taking it to the next step. So you're not locking in early, but you're also kind of thinking, okay, well, where can I use the cards that I picked up early? Maybe I am starting to streamline a little bit to blue-red, but can I also splash a green card? And as the draft goes on, you're kind of going, oh, that's a really powerful blue card, let's say, or a rare, and maybe it's a splashable rare. Well, that wasn't really in my plan before, but can I make it part of my plan? And I think you want to be asking yourself these questions so much of the time. Just like, how can I drive my draft in a direction that just goes smoothly with the cards I'm seeing? And not so much trying to fit it into a box, right? Of this is what a blue-red deck needs to look like. It's much more modular than that. Just how the cards are in this set. The cards are modular. And you really want to be every single pick of the draft updating your priors of what you think your deck is. Because it's going to, like I said, it's going to morph as you go on, and it's probably not going to be what you thought it was at the beginning of the draft. I think a lot of the time when you take a card, pick one, pack one, you start envisioning what the deck will look like. And I think that's good to do still, right? And go okay, well, I first picked a Herd Migration, which is the domain 7-mana rare payoff that makes a bunch of elephants for your domain count. And maybe that's not the best example because I think that can be splashed anywhere, but it can be very easy to be okay, I'm going to be the domain deck with this card. And maybe you are, maybe you're not. Maybe you streamline to, hey, you know what? The lands aren't coming to me, so it can't be the full domain deck. Maybe I should just be a black-green deck and have a few sources to make 3 elephants off this card, for example, right? I can apply that to any draft where, yes, it's good to have an idea of where you want to take your draft, but don't lock into that. Keep an open mind, keep on going, keep gardening as you're drafting. Another habit of a highly successful Dominaria drafter is they take synergy into account without taking bad cards too early. So one of the things you might have heard about this format is synergy is important. Synergy, it's all about the synergy, right? And this is true, but one of the things I always warn about when you're talking about synergy, and I talked about this in the synergy episode of the podcast a few months ago, is don't get tricked into taking bad cards too early, right? And so what I mean by this is it's very easy to be like, oh, this set's all about synergy. So you first pick I keep using Balmor as the example here, but I think it's a good one. Blue-red, you first pick that blue-red gold card, and you're like, okay, I'm going to be a spells deck. And again, this ties into the other trap of like locking in too early and not gardening and being an architect. But if you draft Balmor or any spells payoff, and then by pick 5, you're like, well, synergy really matters. I want to pick up spells. And you're picking like a Thrill of Possibility, right? Just a 2 mana, discard a card, draw 2 cards. I'm almost certain that there's a better card in that pack to take that's not Thrill of Possibility. It might not specifically be a spell card, but there's probably a better card. It's again, you're kind of dipping into another lane, kind of cherry picking and tasting another card, another payoff, right? Because you just don't need to take those cards too early. So I would really, really advise, maybe you're having trouble and you're like, oh, the setup format's all about synergy. Good cards are still important. It's still important to lock in power early. It's still important to have a good shell of a deck. Once you get to packs 3, packs 2, then you can start taking those more auxiliary cards. It's like, okay, like I have some synergy here that kind of works. But really don't be thinking about that in pack 1, I would say. Yes, you're starting to build towards a deck. But again, pack 1 is all about taking the power, in my opinion. It's not really about carving out your perfect deck. You don't know what your deck is going to look like by that point. You're going to figure that in pack 2. You're going to figure that in pack 3. One of the things that people have asked me about this format, and I mentioned last week too, is how important or how useful is 17 lands data in this format, if you're just looking at the 17 lands win rates. And my original thought was not that important, because synergy does matter quite a bit in this format, and card values are modular. You might be in a deck where some medium card ends up being good because you have the synergy pieces for it. But I would actually kind of retract that a little bit and say it's actually pretty important. At least if you're having trouble in this format. If you're having trouble in this format, I've noticed that a big thing is just the card evaluation and taking weak cards too early. If you are struggling, I would suggest going on 17 lands and doing what 17 lands does best, honestly. Giving you a baseline of power level. Because I've seen so many examples of people overlooking really powerful cards or passing up on really powerful cards. 1, because maybe they don't know they're very good. Or 2, maybe, again, they're leaning too hard into synergy too early. So this is just another trap that you can fall into. I would say that if you're an expert in this format or you're really, you feel like you've got a good handle on it, then yes, 17 lands is probably a little bit less useful. You can use your own intuition. You can say, hey, this not so well performing card could be good in my deck. But if you're struggling, go buy 17 lands, use that as a good baseline, and then you can graduate to not needing to use it as much. So the 17 lands data matter? Yes, I would say it's actually pretty important if you're struggling in the format. Okay, and my last habit of highly successful Dominaria drafters is they have a fundamental understanding of what makes decks work. I think that one of the reasons that longtime players, and content creators too, have had such a positive opinion of this set is that the set really rewards fundamentals of deck building. Since there are very few handholds, there aren't super prescriptive synergies that guide you into a deck. It's kind of just this pool of magic cards that have different effects, and it's like, okay, go wild, here, build a deck, right? And people that have been playing for quite a while, they've kind of built up a repertoire of what makes a good control deck, what makes a good aggro deck, what makes decks tick, basically. In other formats, when you're trying to learn how to draft, a blue-white deck, I can tell you what's important for those decks, what's the best cards, the pieces you need for making that deck work, right? Just as the Archetypes drafting, like I was talking about, kind of having understanding beforehand and going and picking them up. In Dominaria, when it's like, okay, well, it's more like, well, what does your blue-red deck look like? It's not what does a blue-red deck want in general, it's what does your blue-red deck want? Are you trying to power out Tolarian Terrors? Do you have Balmor? Do you have Electrostatic Infantry, the 1/2 red creature that grows when you cast spells? Do you have a Wrath that you first pick, right? There's so many variants of what a color pair could look like that you really have to pay attention to what your payoffs are and how to enable them. So, for example, if I do have a bunch of Tolarian Terrors, which is the 7 mana blue creature that gets cheaper for each spell in your grave and has ward 2, I'm likely going to try to play a slightly longer game, right? And so my spell slots are going to be dedicated to cheap interaction, Phyrexian espionages, a bunch of card draw. I'm less likely to care about stuff like timely interference, impede momentum, because I'm not, probably my early game is going to be a lot about casting cards that affect the board to help me die, or just getting some card advantage to start help me hit my lands. On the flip side, if my deck is full of cheap spell payoffs like Electrostatic Infantry and Balmor, it's much more likely that my spell slots are going to be cheap cantripping spells, right? Stuff like Impulse, stuff like Timely Interference, right? Stuff that draws you into more spells. Maybe you've got more creatures, you got like maybe 14 creatures, and you're going, play my creatures, cast my cheap spells, cantripping spells, chain a bunch of stuff. Where the Tolarian Terror game plan is much more control the board, play my terrors. There's some crossover there for sure, but that's what this format's about, right? It's about finding those nuances there. One of the most asked questions I got this week is, how many spells does blue-red want? And the thing about that question is, I think it's just the wrong question to ask. And I get why people are asking it. Spells decks, they tend to be kind of unfamiliar territory, since I think a lot of players just kind of have this mindset that limited decks, they have to have this minimum number of creatures, and they're like, oh, you've got, 4 creatures, what are you doing? Like, how does that work, right? Really, the question isn't, how many spells does a blue-red deck want? That's not a question I can answer unless you tell me what your payoffs are. What does the deck look like? It could be 8 creatures. It could be 12 creatures. I had a deck with 4 creatures this week, right? It's like super, super heavy control deck with only a few finishers. When I say these drafters have a fundamental understanding of what makes a deck work, it's knowing a good ratio of token makers and anthems. It's knowing, the fundamentals of a good mana base. It's getting a sense of how your deck is going to play so that you can build it accordingly, right? I think a good example is, look at a Go Wide's token deck, right? Does it want tricks? Well, maybe sometimes, and there are some tricks that are really, really good in this set, but, most of the time, my Go Wide tokens deck, they're not really attacking with their 2-drops all that early, right? But maybe they get in some chip damage, but I'm not pushing damage by attacking with my 2s and 3s. I'm pushing damage by playing a bunch of tokens and then pumping eventually with a mass pump spell. So I don't care that much about a combat trick because I'm not trying to force through one creature, right? It's kind of that kind of stuff. And this isn't easy, right? It comes with time, but, like with any of these really tough Magic concepts that I talk about, it starts with thinking about it. It starts with asking these kind of questions. It is a little intimidating, I will admit, but the first step is just acknowledging that this is what you have to think about, acknowledging that it's a step towards figuring this stuff out, and again, just asking yourself those questions, and eventually you will get there, but you got to start somewhere, basically. Okay, so that's my big picture ramblings. Let's get into some actual cards, some actual archetypes. Talked about a lot of abstract stuff, but let's get into some actual cards and archetypes here. I'm again going to quote Ben and Ethan from Lords of the Limited this week, and one of the things that they said I think was really good for framing this format is if you look at the cycle of cost reducers, Argivian Phalanx, Tolarian Terror, Writhing Necromass, Yavimaya Sojourner, Molten Monstrosity, those kind of act as signposts for the main archetypes in this set, which are, white Go Wide, blue spells, black self-mill and graveyard, red one's a little bit less defined, but green domain, right? And if you're trying to conceptualize the decks in this format, think of those as your shells, right? The shells of your deck. And again, it's not like, I know exactly what my Argivian Phalanx deck looks like or wants. All right, so I know the exact cards that my Yavimaya Sojourner deck wants and looks like. But it's like, if you just think of the decks in this format as, I've got this white shell of tokens and token payoffs. And then the stuff around that can always be different. And sometimes you're complementing the white with some red. Sometimes you're complementing the blue with some black. Mostly think about your deck as one of these shells, though. One of these pillars or signposts. It's like, I fit into one of these 5 colors. This is the main shell I'm building around, and I'll figure out the rest later. It could be a combination of multiple shells, to be honest. You could have some spell stuff, some death stuff in the graveyard. Some of them are more likely to cross over than others. I don't think I've had very many stuff in the graveyard Go Wide decks. That doesn't work all that well. But I think if you're just having trouble conceptualizing the archetypes, this is a pretty good way to go about it. So let's just go through them quickly here. Blue spells. I really like blue in this format. One fish that I can give you is that blue is really good, and I think pretty underdrafted. So Tolarian Terror, of course, which is that 7 mana 5/5 that gets cheaper for spells in your graveyard. This card's great. I'm sure if you've played Answer with this card, you've realized this card's great. One of the top commons. Well, it's kind of funny because Blue's got a lot of really good commons. This is kind of the payoff card for it. Blue's spells are undervalued, and you can just have this nice package of, again, it's that shell, this blue shell of like Essence Scatter, Tolarian Geyser, Phyrexian Espionage, Impulse. All those cards are great, and whatever you fill out your deck around those cards, it doesn't matter that much because you've just got the shell. And I don't think, like, if you're looking for some sort of guide, just draft those cards. Those cheap cards, fill out your deck with whatever else, and then cast your terrors. That's like honestly, it sounds really simplistic, and it sounds overly simplistic in a way, but it's kind of, I've been going on about how this format is complex, but the shells of the archetypes are pretty simple. I'm going to go over these cards a bit later, but I do just want to mention again that Essence Scatter, Geyser, Espionage, Impulse, all fantastic, all going way later than they should. They're all just cards I will play, not infinite copies of, but it's been hard for me to get to the point where I really wanted to cut these cards. I'll cut other cards other than these cards first generally because they create such a good shell, such a good controlling blue shell. Domain decks. Domain decks are, I could probably talk a whole podcast about them because it's a really large umbrella term, but here's just some small tips that I want to put forth here. So when you're drafting a domain deck, think of them as mid-range decks. I think it's really easy to think of like, 5-color or 4-color, I'm a controlling, grindy deck. I mean, sometimes they lean that way if you're black or blue, but if you're like green base, especially like green white or green red, they're just mid-range decks. And what that means is you are going to try to play big creatures that scale, stuff like Root Wallas and Neshoba Brawlers, and you're going to try to be attacking most of the time. You've got stuff like Miria's Outrider at the top of your curve, too. The 5 mana 4/4 reach. When it enters the battlefield, you deal damage equal to your domain. That card's really been an overperformer. Really like that card. You're mostly just like this aggro deck. And not aggro deck's not the right word, because I did describe it more as mid-range. But you're a deck that's looking to attack. And the advantage that you have over other decks that might be looking to attack is your threats are bigger along the curve, at every point in the curve, than a white deck, for example. The white decks have their advantages too, but you've just got large things and you can leverage that. One of the ways you want to leverage that is combat tricks. You might think that combat tricks don't go super well in these decks because, combat tricks are generally for aggressive decks, but again, you are attacking a lot of the time. And I think another great thing about the combat tricks in this set is they're just really, really powerful, but they help you make up a tempo loss that you tend to take when you're playing a domain deck. What I mean by that is because you have a lot of tap lands in these domain decks, you're often playing 7 tap lands to get to all your colored sources, hit your domain counts. There's a lot of points on the curve where you can't efficiently have a good turn because you're playing a tap land, maybe you're falling a step behind. Something like Gaia's Might, which I think is a really overperformer, a card that's underrated, which is the 1 mana green instant domain. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each basic land type you control. Sometimes you just kill your opponent with it, just like a turn sooner than they expect you to. But other times it's like, okay, I'm in a tight combat situation early. I'm a little bit behind on mana compared to my opponent because I played tap lands. I have a creature. This Gaia's Might is exactly what I need to, my opponent attacks in on turn 4. I know they're going to plan to cast a trick. This Gaia's Might really helps me win that combat for 1 mana, get a mana and tempo advantage, and then next turn you can untap and your opponent has less of a board and you can start to stabilize, right? So Gaia's Might really plays both ways super, super well. It's a card that I've just been playing more and more and more of. Again, sometimes it just kills them, but there's a lot of turns where you just get that that nice tempo advantage when you're falling behind. In general, really prioritize 1 and 2 mana cards in the domain decks, I've found. Again, because you fall behind sometimes, you got these tap lands, it's important to make relevant plays when you've only got 1 or 2 mana available. And sometimes this can be as early as turn 3, right? Your opponent's played a 2, you've played a bunch of tap lands, you need to do something. Sometimes you don't have a 2-drop, and even if you do have a 2-drop, maybe it doesn't line up well against your opponents. Stuff like Runic Shot, the single mana white sorcery, destroy target tap creature. If it was kicked for a blue, you can scry 2. That's a card I really prioritize. The Shock, right? The 2 mana Flowstone infusion. That's another card I think you should really prioritize. Where the domain decks often have a weakness is those early setting up turns. They really, take over later. And so if you can shore up that weakness, you're advantaged against a lot of decks in the format. So yeah, take cheap cards, really. And it's very tempting to take a lot of expensive cards. Mind you, I think you need a balance. I think you do really want some good top end too. I would suggest maybe like 5 or 6 good top end domain threats, but really prioritize those cheap cards. Another thing I would say about the domain decks, and I think a misstep that I see some people make, is taking the lands too highly. So this is a bit weird to say after, every content creator and their mother has said, take lands highly in this set and like every set. Lands are often undervalued. But I think the strategy of take a bunch of lands early and then take domain payoffs later doesn't really work that well in this set. So while I think you should be taking lands when there's nothing great in the pack, don't take lands over the good spells, over the good payoffs, over like, I don't know, to give just like a rough number, like a C plus or a B minus level card. I think that while it's important to have lands in your final product, you don't want to go about taking lands too early. One, because you might end up in a spot where you just have all the lands and somebody else is taking the domain payoffs and you end up with like a bunch of mopey spells. But two, there's a risk of taking lands without knowing that you're going to put them in your deck. And now the domain decks have a higher likelihood of just playing a given land than any other deck, right? Of course, because they often are multiple colors. Sometimes my like red-green base domain deck will just appreciate one blue-black land so I can get a bunch of, I can get 4 domain off of 2 lands. At the same time, don't do that too aggressively. Don't just take all the lands too highly, because you do generally want your lands to touch your main colors, right? You want all the lands in your deck to, mostly all your lands, to, for example, if you're green-red, touch either green or red. And if you don't know your base 2 colors, which you should have a base of 2 colors generally, and you're not going to know your base of 2 colors early on, it can be a bit of a trap to take, for example, a black-green land when, well, you're most likely going to be green, so that's not a good example. It could be a little bit of a trap to take a blue-white land if you don't know that blue or white is going to be your base color, right? So really try to align your dual lands with your base colors. That just makes your mana base a lot better. White aggro. So moving on to white aggro here. So when drafting an aggro deck in any format, it's really important to ask yourself, what tools am I using to push damage? Am I a combat trick based deck? Am I a burn spell heavy deck? Am I a green stompy deck that just has large creatures in it that attack past the opponent? And the answer to that question, in the vast majority of your decks, white decks in this format, is you're going to be just going wide with tokens, Argivian Cavaliers, Captain's Call, and casting an Anthem of some sort. Heroic Charge is the best one, I believe. 2 white for the instant. Your creatures get +2/+1, and if you kick it for 1 red, they get trample as well. That thing can just give you lethal out of nowhere. Really, really great. And that's just your plan, right? That is the core plan. That's the main plan of most of your white decks. Now, I mentioned before that your go wide decks don't necessarily want combat tricks, right? Because you're not generally planning to force through early 2-drops and 3-drops. You're just kind of planning to play a bunch of tokens, make it so that your opponent can't really attack through your tokens, because you can set up good trades if they do. Whenever your opponent has like a 3-1 against your token deck, it's a nightmare for them. And then you Anthem eventually, right? It's like you're taking the early turns to set up, and then you Anthem eventually after you find it. It's not really about pushing early damage, or that's not your main priority, right? The exception to that is Take Up Shield, which is 1 and a white for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature against lifelink indestructible until end of turn. I will play this in any of my white decks, even if my main mode of pushing damage is, Heroic Charge or anything that pumps your team, just because this card is so good. It's just the most pushed trick in the format, I believe. Basically, don't look at this card as filling your trick slot. Just kind of look at it as a good card. Like, if you just look at it as a card, if you put it in your deck, good things will happen. Because sometimes you do go tall with your deck. You can't have just all token makers. This isn't constructed. You're going to have some banal sleepers, just like 2-mana 3-1s, right? And sometimes, you attack in the other turn and you take up shield, your thing's now bigger, you gain a bunch of life, you got a little bit of a life buffer. It's still just really, really good. There's a lot of situations where it's going to be good. So even if your deck's main mode of pushing damage is Anthems, still a good card. I want to call out Keldon's Strike Team as a card I think is pretty underrated. Oh, worth noting too, I should say. I think that the best deck for going wide is red-white. I mean, I know that sounds obvious. That's just like red-white's thing. But I think if you are green, there's not really a lot of incentives to go wide in green. There's the combat trick that gives +2/+2 and then pumps your team if you kick it for white. Puts counters on your team. That's a good card. But most of the time when I'm green, I find I'm just doing domain stuff. It's really hard for me to pair my white cards with my green cards because most of them don't overlap that well. And if I'm starting white, the secondary color I pick up is just very rarely green, basically. Blue-white, if you have Wrath, the 1/3 that pumps the team, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you can tap 2 creatures to draw a card. That card's fine. It's definitely a good way to pump your team too, but it's a less common place I end up personally. And then there's black-white, which is a little bit more attrition-y, a little bit more about just like grinding. Yes, you can go wide and cast your anthems too there, but red-white is the most common place I find myself, specifically because Keldon Strike Team, which is just a fantastic card, a lot better than it looks. So this is the 2 red 3/1 that enters the battlefield, and it gives all your things haste. And if you kick it for 1 and a right white, it gives you 2 1/1 soldiers. Playing this on 3 sometimes gets the job done if you can get just a free hidden for 3. This is a gold card in a way, meaning that a lot of people won't want it. Unlike something like Captain's Call, which is another way to go wide, or Orgivian Cavalier, which is the 3-mana 2/2, make a 1/1. Other people at the table just take those cards. You can just get Keldon Strike Teams a little bit later, if the lane is open, of course. And the Keldon Strike Teams are just fantastic. Like, they're so good at pushing damage. They're small bodies, but a lot of the time your opponent will only have like 1 or 2 things around. And if you've gone Cavalier into another creature into Strike Team, you can just attack all, and maybe they eat one of your creatures, but you're getting a lot of damage. That's to say nothing of the times when you just cast a Strike Team into a Strike Team, and then you have an Anthem, right? Like I said, these decks don't always play out as, I am attacking you early. Sometimes they're just setting up for the first 5-6 turns, and then what's your opponent going to do? You attack with everything, and it's like, well, I know they have the charge, and I just have to block accordingly. I'm going to lose most of my team and take a bunch of damage, and they're going to have a team. So I also want to call out one kind of trap card. Argivian Phalanx, which is the cost reducer in white. This is the 5 and a white 4/4 vigilance that gets cheaper for each creature you control. Like, this isn't a bad card, but it's not one you should prioritize. It just doesn't fit into the game plan very well. Like, it doesn't do anything particularly well. And sometimes it's really awkward. Sometimes they do have a draw where, you play your 2-drop, they kill it. You play a 3-drop, they kill it. And it's like, okay, well, I've got this like 5-drop stuck in my hand. And the payoff is like, all right, what to do a 4/4? And when your plan is just going wide and heroic charging, the 4/4 just doesn't matter that much. Like, yes, it's fine on the battlefield. I'm not trying to say it's terrible, but it's just not a card you need to prioritize. Red aggro. So red aggro is a deck that I don't have a ton of experience with. I've drafted it a few times, and I'm talking base red aggro, where base white aggro is a bit different. Base red aggro, I think, is a deck that I am very interested in drafting, but I think currently the red cards are being taken too highly, like the bad red cards or the kind of dorky ones, for you to get this a good version of the red aggro deck. This week, I went to a testing team meeting for a bunch of really good Toronto Magic players. I went, Neos in my Twitch chat is somebody. He's Mark Anderson, former Canadian Nationals champ. He hosted something at his house. It was really cool. And we did like this limited testing meeting where we just like talked about the commons and talked about where we think the format's going, that kind of stuff. And one of the things he brought up was he thought there was this potential mono red deck that might emerge in the next few weeks as the kind of dorky red cards. Oh, people realize they're not that good, right? Like the 2/3 Kavu Menace that can pump. There's just like, the Enlist Gorilla for 2 mana. And like, these cards aren't terrible by any means, but I think if you just look at where they're being taken on 17 lands, I think they're being taken a little bit too highly. Now, I will shout out also Beers SC, who's another chat member of the community. I think he's like close to Mythic #1 right now. He's been championing red-green aggro, which is a deck I've, again, really wanted to get into, but I think it's just a little bit difficult because people are drafting the dorky red cards a little bit too highly, and this might change in a week or two, but stuff like Gavamaya Iconoclast, the Colossal Growth, which is the 2-mana green trick that gives +3/+3, and if you kick it for a red, it gives +4/+4 haste and trample. Like, there's just a lot of ways to push a lot of trample damage in green-red. So that's something I'm keeping my eye on, and a little sneak preview for you Limited Level Ups listeners. I am actually going to have Beers on next week to talk about this deck and talk about his experience in the format, so stay tuned for that. And of course, the last deck in the format is Defenders, right? The last big deck. There's also, sorry, I should mention, there's also like the black, grindy mill, self-mill stuff, Writhing Necromass. I haven't found that so much to be a base for a deck, necessarily. It's kind of just like, alright, it gets thrown in there. So I'm not going to talk about it today just because I think it's like not too critical to the format, but just know that like, you know, if you've got the Soul Tender, the 3/1 that mills 3 cards when entering the battlefield, and you've got the Writhing Necromass, which is the black cost-reducing creature that gets cheaper for creatures in your graveyard, yeah, there's something you can build there, but I don't think it's a solid enough core to really call it the center of your deck like you would a white aggro deck or a blue spells deck. Anyways, Defenders. Yeah, so if you haven't heard the news, Wingmantle Chaplain is just busted. This is the 4-mana 0/3, 3 and a white for a Defender. When 8 TBs, you create a 1/1 bird for each creature with Defender you control, and then whenever a Defender enters the battlefield afterwards, you do the same, you make a bird. This is the 3rd most winning card in the set, I believe. In the whole set. It's just really, really difficult for your opponents to come back after you cast this when you have like even just 3 or 4 defenders, right? The birds trade off if you're behind, and then you kind of want ways to buy back or bounce the Chaplain, like Dominaria Geyser or Urborg Repossession, which is a black mana spell that rebuys something from the grave. Like, heaven forbid they have a second one, right? Like, it's just really, really good. If you see a Wingmantle Chaplain, you should take it, pick one, pack 1. You should take it if you see it, pick 4. In pack 2, if you open one, you should consider pivoting. The card that ties the room all together, of course, is the Shield Wall Sentinel. It's the 4-mana 1/3 defender that goes and searches a defender from your deck. This is a card that I tend to speculate on in the middle of the packs. Just, you know, maybe you open up a Chaplain, and maybe you get past the Chaplain, and really is what ties the room together, because what really makes this card busted, the Chaplain, is there's a tutor at common for it, right? Like, you're just going to see it so consistently. And when you have consistency plus power, well, that's a recipe for winning a lot, basically. So, really great. A lot of my trophies have been Wingmantle Chaplain decks. I just posted a YouTube video not too long ago where, you know, just like you could see the power of it. Really, really powerful card, and I'm sure I don't have to sell you on it. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but just in case, I thought I'd do my due diligence here, in case you hadn't heard the word, that Chaplain is very busted. When you're drafting the other Defender payoffs, like the Coral Colony, the Blight Pile, it's a nice secondary payoff. It's just not as important as Chaplain. None of the payoffs are important as Chaplain. The other payoff I like quite a bit is the Bulwark, the 0/3 for 1, the artifact that you can turn your defenders into attackers by paying 2 mana. Again, I like it, but Chaplain is the star of the show here. All right, last up, before we get into some Q&A, some underrated cards I want to talk about. Okay, so first and foremost, the most underrated card in the set, I believe, is Dominaria Geyser. And when I'm talking about underrated, I'm talking both about where I see it in packs, but also looking at 17 lands, average last seen at and average taken at data, which is just basically on 17 lands, it tells you on average where do you see this card in a pack, which tells you how highly people are taking it. And Dominaria Geyser, which is 2 and a blue, sorcery, return target creature to its owner's hand, you draw a card. If the spell was kicked, you gain 3 life, and the kicker is white. Doesn't surprise me that this card is underrated. I believe this is the best common in the set. Better than Lightning Strike, better than whatever. Like, it's just that good. One of the things I figured out this week that is partially due to people underrating it, causing people underrating it, is a lot of people are reading this as the draw card part is part of the kicker. You don't have to kick this card to draw a card. He always draws a card. But yeah, this card is great, and it falls in, it's just the next card in a long line of cards that bounce something and draw a card. These cards are always underrated. We've got Lunar Rejection from Crimson Vow, Out of the Way from Streets of New Capenna. If I had to guess, I would say that these types of cards are underrated because people don't consider them, they don't see them as real removal. Maybe people see them more, closer to like an unsummon. And, while it's true that these creatures or these cards don't get something off the battlefield for good, bouncing something and drawing a card, usually at a mana advantage, is just a huge deal. So many games of Limited come down to A, winning a race, and this card wins a race very well because it gains you life and bounces something and makes them replay it, gets a blocker out of the way maybe, or B, being able to spend your mana more efficiently than your opponents. And Dominaria Geyser and cards like it excel in those games and types of games that those things happen in. You know, just imagine your opponent plays like a 5 mana creature that doesn't have an end to the battlefield effect, and you have a geyser in hand. It just feels awesome. You set your opponent back so far. One of the things to take note of this card is you don't have to kick it for it to be good. I'm gonna play this in any blue deck. I don't really care about picking up dual lands to kick it, to be honest. It's nice, it's incidental, but I'm just gonna put it in any blue deck and play as many copies as I possibly can. Those 3 blue spells that I was talking about earlier: Essence Scatter, Impulse, and Phyrexian Espionage. So let's just go one by one here. Essence Scatter, I think people maybe don't look at this as a just removal spell, but I think that's the best way to look at it. Like, if you just look at it as a, mind you, timing specific removal spell, where you have to like have the mana open, which isn't that big of a deal for the blue decks in this format, but it's just a 2 mana removal spell that obviously stops enter the battlefield effects, kills 7 drops, trades up on mana so much of the time, is a 2-drop for when you need a 2-drop. It just kind of does it all. And I think maybe this is a holdover from most counter spells being a little bit mediocre and limited. Usually 3 mana counter spells are not so good, but the difference between a 2 mana counter spell and a 3 mana counter spell is just so huge, right? In the mid game, you can double spell, you can play a 2-drop on 4, hold this up, play a 3-drop on 5, hold this up. It's just really difficult to play around this card if you're opponent. And a lot of people, like, if your opponent plays around this card, you're even happier, right? Because you're like, okay, cool. Like, you didn't play your awesome creature, you played kind of a dorkier one. Okay, I'll just block instead of needing to counter it. Essence Scatter is just another card that I am really likely to play almost all the copies of as I can get. It's just, I don't really think it's a card that has that many diminishing returns. Impulse. This is the 2 mana, 1 in a blue instant. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So we've had Anticipate for a lot of sets, right? Which is just this card, but it looks at 1 card less, right? It looks at 3 cards. And what makes Impulse good but Anticipate mediocre? I mean, to put it simply, you go 1 card deeper, right? Like, the hypergeometric math of looking 1 card deeper, it really matters, right? And I don't have the numbers offhand to rattle off, but just looking 4 cards deep for what you need, a land, looking for a specific card, really matters a lot more than 3 cards. To the point where I'm pretty happy to play this card in a lot of my deck. Whether you're a domain deck, trying to find the right lands to boost your domain count, or you're just trying to find land drops, or you're trying to find a specific removal spell, or you're like a spells deck where this helps you chain together spells, this is just a card that I'm not as likely to play all the copies of this as I can, you know, like Essence Scatter or Geyser or Phyrexian Espionage, but I will generally play the first copy or 2 in my blue decks, and especially if like my 20 or 23rd card in my deck are pretty medium, I'll just play Impulse instead, because it just replaces those cards. It makes it more consistent, makes you draw your good cards more often instead of drawing dorky ones, right? So yeah, this is just, plays really nicely as a Magic card, and of course has some context in the format with the spells deck if you care about that. And then I want to talk about Phyrexian Espionage. So this is the 3 mana divination effect, 2 in a blue, sorcery, draw 2 cards, and if it was kicked, each opponent discards a card. The kicker is 1 in a black. One of the top commons in my mind as well. Like, this is a kind of card that has not been at a premium in most formats that we've played lately. You know, sometimes you just can't afford to cast a divination on 3, but I think that Dominaria United, it kind of bucks the trend a little bit. When I'm trying to think, okay, well, what makes a divination good in a format? Or what makes Phyrexian Espionage good? Or what makes a format bad for these cards? A format that's good for divinations, one, is a format that's slower, or has like middle of the road game length, right? Where you're not ending the game on turn 6. Raw card advantage is better in slower formats for sure. Where you can cast it and not just die, and you care about like grinding your opponent out a little bit. But part of the appeal of a divination effect is that it helps hit your land drops early in the game. In some formats, when you take turn 3 off, it's just a death sentence. And I don't think that's really true in this format, but your opponent can play a 2. It's probably not that threatening of a 2. You can cast Espionage on 3, hit your land drops, and go from there, right? So just like taking that turn 3 up off to set up is not that big of a deal. 2, divinations are really good in formats where you care about hitting land drops 5 or 6 plus. Part of the range of casting a draw spell is that sometimes you're just going to draw into more lands, right? And that's not such a bad thing when you're in a format like this one, where there's a bunch of places to put your mana, and in addition, sometimes drawing lands, like dual lands in your domain decks, actually act as like value lands, right? Because you draw, you're playing blue-black and you draw a blue-white land. Well, that adds to your domain count for whatever domain card you have. Or just helps you find your splash, and you're splashing quite often in this format. And then 3, I think that I really value this kind of card advantage, just kind of like raw card advantage, in formats where outgrinding your opponent is a real game plan. So Dominaria is pretty light on like Mulldrifter style cards, like cards that they enter the battlefield, creatures that enter the battlefield draw you cards, like an Organ Hoarder, Inspiring Overseer. There's not too many of those types of cards. In formats with those types of cards, it's very difficult to do the 1-for-1, kill your thing, then I cast some card draw and I outgrind you. But since there's not that many Mulldrifter style cards in this format, or Organ Hoarder, if I'm to use the Zoomer terminology, I suppose, you can have a game plan where it's just like, kill your thing, counter your thing, kill your thing, kick an Espionage to make you discard a card, draw some cards, and you just completely outgrind them. So that's a real game plan that I've really liked in this format. All of these cards, Impulse, Scatter, Espionage, like I mentioned, really form a nice core for those blue spells decks. And Espionage, just like Essence Scatter, is a card that I'll probably play the first 2 or 3 copies. Now, mind you, when you have a card like this, you do want to prioritize cheap interaction a lot, like Tribute to Urborg style cards, because you do want to maybe kill their 2-drop so you don't get pressured. Also, when you're drawing a bunch of cards, you want to be able to cast all your cards in a timely manner, so cheap cards are better than expensive cards. But if you fulfill those requirements, I think Espionage is great. And in those really grindy matchups, again, you can kick it, and your opponent does feel that pain a lot of the time. Urborg Repossession. So I'm sure this is one that many people have caught on to is a great card. But again, if I'm going off of 17 lands data and what is undervalued, this card goes pretty late. It wheels some of the time, goes 6th or 7th. This is the single black mana sorcery that you can return a creature from your grave to your hand. And if you kick it for 1 and a green, you return another permanent as well from your graveyard to your hand. Oh, also, sorry, if you just don't kick it, naturally, you gain 2 life too. So yeah, this card's just great. I'll play multiple copies. It's just good for getting back your valuable creatures. In your domain deck, you kind of have these like haymaking 5 and 6 drops that maybe die sometimes, and you just buy them back. If you can kick it, all the better. But one of the better ways to grind your opponent out. I was just talking about, the ability to actually grind your opponent out of the game and run them out of cards. I think this is a really good tool for doing that because, when you make a bunch of trades and then you cast this and get back your 2 best things, your opponents just can't come back from that a lot of the time. So really prioritize this card. Like I said, I'll play 2 or 3 a lot of the time. Take Up Shield. I talked about this one, so I don't have to talk about too much. The only thing I want to say about Take Up Shield is you should just play this card in all of your white decks, regardless of what they look like. And you should maybe even splash it sometimes if you have the capacity to do so. Like, in a domain deck, I've splashed this card quite a bit. Again, you tend to have these big haymakers that are the targets of removal spells, and you also tend to be a little bit behind on life total. You get pressure early. This card solves both those problems, right? You gain a bunch of life, or you protect your creature. Obviously, it's just good in the white aggro decks, like I was talking about, but really just a quality card. Don't look at this as like, yeah, a pretty good combat trick. It's just a very good card that happens to be a combat trick. Destroy Evil. This is a big one. So Destroy Evil is 1 and a white for an instant that says destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. Very much looks like a sideboard card, but isn't. It's just a good main deck card, and I will play 2 or 3 of them a lot of the time. So if you just think about the decks in the format, looking by colors, and thinking, well, is this card going to be good in the matchup? Okay, so think about white decks. Well, it's good against white decks because they've got Citizen's Arrests and Prayer of Binding. So it's got these Oblivion Ring style enchantment-based removal spells, so you can hit those and blow them up. Also, you can kill just your opponent's creatures in response to a pump spell. It's good against all of the cost-reducing creatures, like the Talarian Terrors and the Writhing Necromass, which are just fixtures of the format, cards you see a lot. And it's also just pretty good against some of the aggro decks, too, that maybe are a little bit stompier. Like, I was talking about how some of the aggro decks don't always want combat tricks, but there are decks that do want combat tricks. And part of what makes this card good compared to a card like Smite the Monstrous that costs 4 mana for this effect usually, is that, your opponent, a good opponent won't cast their combat trick into 4 open mana, right? They're just not going to do that. And so you can't blow out a combat trick with Smite the Monstrous. But they're a lot more likely to do it against a 2 mana, you leaving up 2 mana, right? So it's like, they feel pretty safe against like white and green. You have like a white land and a green land. It's like, okay, cast my trick. And it's like, nope, Destroy Evil. So It's just got a lot of flexibility. It's got a lot more spots in the games that you might expect it to be good. And like I said, I'll play multiple copies of this card. Goblin Picker is kind of a weird one that I actually haven't seen too many people talk about. So this is 1 red for a 2/2 Goblin. It has the ability red tap, discard a card, and draw a card. So I wasn't playing this card until I looked at its stats on 17 lands. And it's winning at a rate that's pretty similar to like some, I don't have the cards offhand, but like C+ level cards, basically. Like, pretty good cards that you'd be like if you just look at the cards and you're like, oh, this card is close to Goblin Picker? Oh, that's kind of funny. Like, that doesn't seem to belong with, with the rest of these cards. It's just a really good way to mitigate flood in the mid-game. Like, the blue decks are really, really good at not flooding in the domain decks because they have a lot of ways to spend their mana. But the white and the red decks are really, really poor at it. And sometimes you just, like, draw the wrong half of your deck, you draw the anthems with the tokens, or vice versa. And Goblin Picker just really seamlessly helps you grind, helps you find the cards you need, while just being a 2-drop creature. So just start playing this card a little bit more. You don't have to take it highly. People aren't taking it highly, but it's a totally serviceable 2-drop. You know, you can play a copy or two, and yeah, it just solves a lot of the problems that these red decks have. And then the last one I want to talk about here is Crystal Grotto. So this is the land that enters the battlefield, scries 1, taps to add a colorless, and you can 1-tap add a mana of any color. So these kind of cards, generally, you'll hear myself and a lot of content creators say, not very good. These are like you're paying too much of a premium for your fixing, because your spell that you're casting, that you're fixing for, you're splashing for, this card makes it cost 1 more. And that's just not very good. You should generally just put in a basic of whatever color you're splashing instead. Well, I don't think this is premium fixing. I think that you should definitely be hoping to pick up dual lands rather than this card. I do think it has a place in the format if you end up in a spot where, you know, I'm sure you've drafted, if you've drafted this form at all, you've kind of ended up in spots where it's like, well, the mana didn't quite get there. Or I have a few off-color kicker cards that I would like to kick. Or I just like need a 5-color source to tie the room together. And cards like Grotto, cards like the Salvaged Mana Worker, cards like, even like the Relic, the 3-mana Relic that adds a mana of any color, and you tap a legendary creature to add a mana of any color. I've played these cards when I do just need the fixing. And so they're kind of necessary evils, but when you're 5 colors, when you've got a lot of off-color things, this card is serviceable. And I don't want to discount the Scry as well. I think the Scry is a pretty important part of the card. It does help you find your lands when you need them. Helps you set up your next turn. You know, scrying on a land is pretty powerful. So where you should play this card is where your mana needs a little bit of help, and the cards you're splashing are cheap. Because one of the big downsides of this card, like I mentioned, is it makes your card more expensive. So you don't really want to be splashing like a 7-drop off this card. I don't think that's very good. But if you're splashing a cheap interaction spell, if you're splashing a kicker cost on something, yeah, that makes more sense. And you do want it to be in like a 4 or 5 color deck, so it actually pulls its weight. You want to be able to say, okay, this is going to make me red and blue and green over the course of this game. If you're closer to a 2-color deck or a 3-color deck, just play a basic, because that's going to do what you want more often. And then I have one last section before we get to the Q&A. Overrated cards. And this is pretty straightforward. There's not too many here. But the first group of cards here is gold uncommons that help the go wide theme. So we've got Zar Ojanin, which is the 3 green-white 4/4 domain. When it becomes tapped, you put a counter on each creature you control with toughness less than the number of basic land types you control. Aaron, Benalia's Ruin, white, black for a 3/3 menace. White, black, tap, sacrifice another creature, put a counter on each creature you control. And Tori Davenant, Fury Rider. 1 red, white, 3/3 vigilance trample. When it attacks, all your creatures get +1/+1. Your red creatures gain trample, and your white creatures, you untap them. These cards are okay. Like, I wouldn't feel terrible about putting them in my deck, but they just do the job of Heroic Charge so much worse than Heroic Charge, or just anything else that gives, you know, pumps your team. Wrath is another good way to pump your team. Where these ones, they have to, like, come down, survive a turn, and you just, like, give your opponents too many options, basically. And again, one of the ways that these decks tend to play out, these go-wide token decks, is they're not always going to be curving out on you and killing you on curve. They're kind of sitting around for a bit. If you're just sitting around for a bit, setting up your tokens, well, Zaro Janin, your opponent's also probably got a board state too. So what's the Zaro Janin going to do? Well, it's going to attack, and your opponent probably has a decent double block. Yes, it pumps your team too, but unless you have an extremely wide board state, that's probably not going to be that much of a problem. Your opponent can probably mitigate it. And it's a 5-mana creature, right? This is a format that is hostile to 5-mana creatures that don't do anything when they come in, because the removal's pretty good. You really want an end to the battlefield effect on your 5-mana creatures. Same with Aaron, right? With Aaron, you don't really want to be diminishing your board state to grow your other creatures. Just cast a pump spell. Like, that's just going to be a lot better. Tori is the same thing. So again, while these cards are not bad, I think they are overrated in the sense that they are taken extremely highly, and if you look at the win rates on 17 lands, the win rates do not reflect kindly on the power of these cards. They're all pretty middling, and in the case of like Aaron and Zar, they actually bring down, they're lower than the win rate of the decks in general. I think Tori too. Actually, all of these cards their win rates are lower on average than the respective deck they belong in's win rate. So just keep that in mind. Play them, but don't take them highly. That is all for me for what I want to say. Chat, send it to me. Send me some questions you have about the format, things I haven't covered. Thank you once again for hanging out and listening. I'm going to shout out the Patreon one more time. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. And chat, send them to me. I'm sure you have a bunch of questions. Here's a good question relating to what I was just talking about. Does Maro count as a 5-mana creature that doesn't do anything, that doesn't have an ETB effect? So yes, but Maro, Territorial Maro, which is the 5-mana creature, 4 and a green that gets +2/+2 for each of your domain counts, and it can be like a 10/10 for 5. Yes, but the payoff for that card is that you kill your opponent in 2 turns, and they like really can't ignore it. So where the other cards I was talking about, they come down and your opponent's like, okay, I can mitigate that. It's really hard to mitigate a 10/10. There's not a lot of removal that kills them. It's not easy to double block that. It just puts them in the abyss so quickly. So yes, it falls into the category of big thing that doesn't have an enter the battlefield effect, but it is just large enough that that doesn't matter that much. What archetype do you consistently have the most fun drafting? / what archetype do you wish to make work? Okay, so as much as I am, known as an aggro player, I really do love myself a kind of all counter spells, all removal, blue-black or blue-white control deck. And that's a archetype that hasn't been very viable in most formats. Again, with, the prevalent of Organ Hoarders and Inspiring Overseer, and, just lately, the cards just haven't existed for that card, or for that kind of archetype to be good. And, well, I think it's still not the best archetype in this format. I think it's an archetype that I draft a lot and I enjoy, and I think is good enough to make me want to draft it, basically. How do I go about drafting 2-color strategies versus full 5-color domain stuff? How do I decide where to go and what's the middle ground? Okay, yeah, so good question. So it really depends on where you start, I would say. And I was talking about how you want to navigate your pack 1 and how you kind of want to just cherry pick a bunch of good cards. And at the end of pack 1, what are your payoffs looking like? Do you have a lot of domain cards? Well, yeah, you're probably going to want to start to enable them, go 4 or 5 colors. Do you not have a lot of domain cards? You're probably going to want to narrow in, be 2 colors, maybe splash with some off-color kicker. Now, where you might deviate from this, or where you might change your mind or your direction, is you start in a domain deck where you're like, okay, I've got a Territorial Maro and an Ashoba Brawler, maybe a rare, and you start to not see the lands, right? And it's just like not a very viable thing you can do, so you just instead start to streamline to 2 colors. Or it's not for the lack of seeing lands, but it's because you see a lot of good cards in just 2 colors, let's say. So let's just say every pack you're just like, well, the best card is green. And the next pack, the best card is green. And the next pack, oh, well, the best card is black. And that just keeps happening. And I found myself naturally, I'm like, okay, well, I've kind of just ended up in a spot where I'm not really domain because I haven't had the lands, and 2 colors are particularly open. So I'm just more streamlined a 2-color deck. I think a lot of times when I end up in 5-color domain, it's when there isn't 2 colors or a particular set of colors that is obviously open at the table. And I'm just like, okay, well, I've got some lands. I can probably just play a bunch of good cards of a bunch of different colors. And because nothing in particular is very open, this is a good thing for me to do in my seat, because I don't need something to be very open and streamlined. I can just like pick up some good cards and fit them all into my deck, right? So basically, the more open a particular color pair is, the less likely I am to be all 5 colors. In the Drafting Archetypes Green-Black deck episode, when asked, Sam said that he drafts with preferences towards that deck. I have experienced that I do better when biasing towards blue control piles, while some streamers bias towards other kinds of decks. Seems like the kind of format that pays you for drafting for decks you're comfortable with when you get the chance. Yeah, I certainly think so. I think it's this kind of funny mix where, yes, because there is a wide range of decks available, you're not pigeonholed into like, well, you need to draft an aggro deck or you need to draft a grindy deck in this format. There is the possibility of drafting a lot of different styles of decks. And if you have the opportunity to draft a deck that you like, I think you're often going to lean into that deck. What I will say, though, is I think if you want overall success in the format, it definitely does pay to be able to draft a go-wide token deck or know what a blue control deck looks like, because, sometimes your deck just isn't going to be open, right? And you do need to pick up the tools of the format and put the tool, the tool in your tool belt of, okay, well, this is what blue-red looks like, or like, the general shell of it, because I can't say for certain what a particular deck looks like in this format very often. So yeah, I think that's true, but I also would encourage, because it's a format that a lot of strategies can be successful, it's also probably a good time to branch out and to, try some decks that maybe you're not as familiar with or comfortable with. Again, this is a long-term versus short-term win rate thing. You'll probably win a lot more in the short term if you stick to what you know, but in the long term, not in just this set, but in Magic sets in general, it's good to branch out a little bit. Is Grotto ever worth it in a 2-color deck? It seems like you can have a good enough mana base to want the Scry. So in a 2-color deck, I would say no. Mostly because it's the whole limited mana bases are pretty bad, and just playing a colorless land, even if it does Scry, the Scry does not offset the fact that you're playing a colorless land. However, if you somehow end up in a close to monocolor deck, I think then, yeah, because then you're just kind of playing a value land basically, where the Scry is just you don't need a million white sources if you're close to mono white. You don't need 16. You can kind of play 12 and maybe a light red splash, and then maybe then the Grotto does something because you care about scrying on your land. I would still, I would say generally lean towards not doing that than doing it. But I can see decks that is a possibility. I wouldn't count it at 100%. What do you think of the 3/1 black mill 3 Soul Tender? The Ham TV is first picking them. I followed this today and had 3 Soul Tenders and 4 Teleria Terrors. The rest of the deck was filler, and it was an easy 7 wins. Yeah, so I think that card is pretty important if you are doing the black self-mill stuff with, Terrors and Writhing Necromancer. I mentioned in the Archetype section that I don't think that's a good enough core that you can consistently have a base black deck where that's what you're doing. It comes up sometimes though, and maybe I'm undervaluing that as a reliable draft strategy. I'm mostly speaking from experience there. It sounds like Ham has again leaned into some preferences there and very much found success, as Ham tends to do. So yeah, that's an important card. I do like that card quite a bit. And yeah, I could definitely believe that I am underselling that card and that strategy as a whole. Any other overrated cards? I did have some other slides, but I feel like I was going a little bit long, but we can take a look quickly. Okay, so some other slides just quickly, now that you asked. A lot of gold cards, a lot more gold cards. I was talking about those other, the go wide payoff gold cards, but a few more. So, Rulik, is that how you pronounce it? Rulik Mons, Warren Chief, Najal, the Storm Runner, which is the 5 mana, is it 5/4 that copies spells. Tura, Kennerid, Sky Knight, the 5 mana 3/3 that makes 1/1s when you cast a instant or sorcery. These kind of have similar problems to the other cards I was talking about, the other gold cards, where they're just kind of expensive. You really hope to attack with them. You really hope your opponent doesn't kill them because you're just going to be down on that exchange of mana so often. And in the case of Rulik Mons, you're it's a 3 mana or 4 mana 3/3 mana. It's that's just not very good. Your opponent just double blocks that and carries on with their day. Najal I think is pretty good because it has a high ceiling. It's got a low floor too. It's just sometimes just can't get an attack, but sometimes it's really good. You do get to copy a Tolarian Geyser or something like that, right? Tura is just very fragile. It's a 5 mana 3/3 flyer. It's just again, these cards aren't terrible, but they all got lower win rates than the average win rate of their color pairs, and they all fall into the just yeah, it's just expensive, and there's good cheap cards in this format, so you don't really need to lean into these. I'll also shout out quickly Rona, Sheoldred's Faithful, which is 1 blue, black, 3/4. Whenever your opponent whenever you cast instant or sorcery, each opponent loses a life. You can cast Rona from your grave by discarding 2 cards. And Queen Alna of Rodak. These names. I've never read this out loud. Green, white for a star, and its power toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. And if you could create a token, you create that many +1 soldiers. Both these cards are just like really dorky. Like Rona's abilities are pretty trinkety, and her body is not that impressive. It's like a 4-mana 3/4, and the drain comes up, but it's not even a drain, it's just life loss. And yeah, casting her from the grave if you've got extra lands is a thing, but both of these cards kind of just fall into the camp of people are taking them too highly, and they're not unplayable, but you should not be taking these before the wheel, basically. The Queen especially is a weird one, because you're like, again, it's kind of got that Argavian Phalanx problem, where you just like don't care that much about going tall in your tokens decks that often. So it's just like, yeah, these cards look appealing, but they just end up not doing that much. What about Rakdos? Any words, or does it just not work? Yeah, I don't think there's like inherently something that makes it just not work. It's just, I just don't see a reason to be in it. Like, black grinds. Okay, so the one thing I can point to that makes it not work is that the colors do have a bit of tension with each other. Black's best thing is grinding. Red's best thing is being aggressive. And, you know, you can supplement your black grindy stuff with red removal spells, certainly. But there's not that many good black aggro cards. So you kind of have to be like this in this space where you're this black grindy deck where red is very, very open, and you prefer to pair it with red rather than green or blue or white, which just help your grindy plan much better generally. And the gold cards don't do you many favors. Like Garna is not particularly good. It falls into the same camp as like Rona and the green-white queen. Oh, Logamos, yeah, the 1/3 that creates 2/1s. That card I've actually seen do things, but like in a very specific deck where my opponent had like infinite bone splinters. Logamos is the 1/3 that every combat you make a 2/1 and then you sacrifice the end of combat. And my opponent just drafted this deck, it seemed, with like 2 of those and like all the bone splinters at the table. So it actually did stuff, but I think in general that card is not very good. So yeah, the gold cards just don't do you many favors, and the cards don't play particularly well together. So I just don't see much of a reason to draft that deck. What is the bread and butter common for the domain decks on the equivalent to lines of the heroic charge go what? Lands. Like, as boring as it sounds, it's basically lands. There's not really this is just the thing other than the lands, because most of your payoffs tend to be at uncommon or rare. Like, there are decent common payoffs. Like, I like the Root Walla, but it's not like, oh, that's what the deck needs. You know, like, it's a solid role player, but it's not just like, this is the thing the deck's doing. By definition, the domain decks being a lot of colors kind of means that you're going to have different focuses in different drafts of different domain decks, right? So sometimes you are focused more in just like blue spells. Sometimes you are focused in like green creatures and ramping and kind of that kind of stuff. So it's not something that I think is like super helpful to think about if you're carrying over draft to draft, except for the lands. That is the most important part. Thank you, everybody, so much for hanging out. Next week, or actually even a little bit sooner, I think we're gonna have beers on in the middle of the week. That episode should come up. So as always, this is gonna be on the Limited Level Ups YouTube. And for YouTube listeners, it's on the Limited Level Ups podcast feed. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll see you next week.